Welcome to Insights into the Industrial Revolution, Part 2, Railways. In this second video in the series, I look at the railways of Great Britain that provided the connectivity that allowed the mass transit of goods and people and enabled the Industrial Revolution to develop faster in Britain than elsewhere. The Great Western Railway. The first public railway in the world to use steam locomotives was the Stockton and Darlington Railway, engineered by George Stephenson and opened in 1825. George's son Robert established the world's first locomotive works in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1823 and was commissioned to build 4 locomotives for the line. The railway age had begun. There were many railway companies, and the lines created enabled goods and people to travel across the country, driving the Industrial Revolution. I doubt that the Industrial Revolution could have happened without such a rapid improvement in communication. In 1830, there were less than 100 miles of public railway in Great Britain. By 1840, there were 1,500 miles of track. By 1850, there were 6,000 miles of railway. And by 1900 there were 22,000 miles of public railway in Great Britain. Possibly the most famous of all the railway companies, and one of the longest lasting, was the Great Western Railway. The GWR was formed by a group of Bristol merchants in 1833. Bristol's status as one of the most important ports in Britain was threatened by the construction of a railway between Liverpool and London. The merchants of Bristol wanted their port connected to the London market too, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, then aged 27, was appointed engineer in March 1833. Brunel designed the line from London to Bristol with a gauge of 7 feet to allow for faster, smoother running. Most other railways at that time used a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. The decision to use the broader gauge would cause problems in the future, but it was a sound one, and if things had turned out differently, we might all be travelling today on beautiful, wide, smooth-running carriages on broad tracks. The first 22 miles of the railway opened in 1838, and the full 117 miles to Bristol was completed in 1841. In conjunction with partner railways, the route was extended to Plymouth in 1849 and right through to Penzance in 1867. The GWR extended into Wales with the completion of the Severn Tunnel in 1886. During the 1850s, the Great Western Railway expanded north into the Midlands, reaching Birmingham in 1852 and Wolverhampton in 1854. This was the furthest north that the 7-foot broad gauge reached. The difference in gauges between these lines and the many 4 feet 8.5 inches lines across the country caused significant problems for through traffic. For a time, several lines existed with both 7-foot and the smaller gauge, but this was expensive and inconvenient. Eventually, Parliament legislated that the narrower gauge should be the country's standard gauge. As the Great Western Railway expanded, it acquired lines that ran on the 4 feet 8.5 inches gauge, and over the 20 years from the early 1870s, the GWR tracks were laid with the narrower gauge. The last broad gauge train ran from London to Penzance in 1892. The Great Western Railway continued its expansion into the early 20th century. By 1900, it had carried over 80 million passenger journeys. The Great Western Steamship Company. In his role as chief engineer for the Great Western Railway, Isambard Kingdom Brunel had suggested to the shareholders that the proposed line could be extended all the way to New York by building a steamship. The idea was taken up, and the Great Western Steamship Company was formed in 1836. Brunel designed the ship, and construction began in 1836. The SS Great Western was launched in 1837 and made her first transatlantic journey in 1838. She averaged 16 days for the outward journey and 13 days for the return. The SS Great Western was sold in 1847 and made voyages to the West Indies and South America until she became a troop ship during the Crimean War. The SS Great Western was scrapped in 1856. The SS Great Britain. The Great Western Steamship Company's next ship was a major step forward in technology. The SS Great Britain was iron-hulled and powered by screw, whereas SS Great Western was a paddle steamer. SS Great Britain was almost 3 times the size of SS Great Western. Launched in 1843, SS Great Britain was the largest liner of its day and was even faster in its crossing of the Atlantic. However, building the ship had cost much more than originally anticipated, and the company was crippled financially. It also suffered severe competition from paddle steamers operated by Samuel Cunard and his business partners, which operated out of Liverpool. In 1846, SS Great Britain ran aground, and the company could not afford to repair her. The Great Western Steamship Company went out of business in 1847, and the SS Great Britain was sold on and refitted. She served on the route to Australia for almost 30 years. She then became a coal transport until she ran aground in the Falkland Islands in 1886. The wreck was recovered and returned to Bristol in 1970. Extensive restoration work has been carried out, and the SS Great Britain is now a visitor attraction in Bristol. As a side note, the SS Great Eastern was also designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, but was unconnected with the Great Western Railway. She was built in London and was even larger than the SS Great Britain. Launched in 1858, just before Brunel died in 1859, her size was not surpassed until 1899. SS Great Eastern operated as a transatlantic passenger liner until 1862, when she was damaged on an uncharted rock. The ship was auctioned off and began a career as a cable layer. She was scrapped in 1889. As another interesting side note, Brunel also designed a prefabricated hospital that was used by Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War and was credited with saving the lives of many wounded soldiers. Railway mania. Travel by train was an amazing new technology, and faster than anyone could have imagined before. The early railways were hugely profitable. The Industrial Revolution took off, and huge amounts of wealth were created. A new middle class of professionals, managers and civil servants began to emerge. New legislation allowed anyone with money to invest in businesses. The first regulated stock exchange was created in London in 1812, and in 1836 stock exchanges were opened in Manchester and Liverpool. But investments were largely unregulated and due diligence was weak. Companies, including railways, were promoted as guaranteed to be profitable investments. In the period to 1846, 263 Acts of Parliament setting up new railway companies were passed, but around a third of the routes authorised were never built. Many of the companies collapsed due to poor financial planning, and some were outright fraudulent schemes. As some companies failed, the share prices of others faltered and then fell. Many middle-class families lost their entire savings. Larger railway companies bought up the failed schemes for a fraction of the money invested. Over 6,000 miles of railway were built in Great Britain as a result of railway mania. Railway mania was a speculative investment frenzy similar to canal mania in the 1790s, and the technology boom and bust period between 1995 and 2000, called the dot-com bubble. It might also be compared to cryptocurrency speculation today. George Hudson. Another giant of the railway age was George Hudson. Born near York in 1800, Hudson inherited his uncle's fortune in 1827 and became an investor in railways. By 1836 he was chairman of the York and North Midland Railway, which ran to Leeds. As early as 1837, Hudson was paying shareholders dividends out of capital. Hudson began to expand his railway throughout Yorkshire and beyond. In 1844 he merged his railway interests into the Midland Railway and began to expand it even more widely across England. Among other interests, George Hudson also became chairman of the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway, which built the famous high-level bridge across the River Tyne in Newcastle, which opened in 1849, and took the railway to the border with Scotland. linking with the North British Railway to Edinburgh. With the possible exception of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, George Hudson was the greatest railway magnate of the mid-19th century. But all was not as it seemed. In 1848, accusations emerged that Hudson was paying dividends out of capital rather than revenue. Hudson had also borrowed heavily to finance the extraordinary growth of his railway companies. Several inquiries were set up, and Hudson was found to have benefited personally from trading in shares at inflated values, as well as fraudulently using money from his companies to finance other schemes. By 1853, legal cases against him meant he had to sell his properties. He fled the country in 1859 to escape a prison term, but returned in 1864 and spent about a year in prison for his debts. He was imprisoned for other debts for a short period in 1865 too. In 1871, the remaining debtor cases against him were dropped, but he died in December of that year. His funeral cortege drove through the city of York, and hundreds of people turned out to pay their last respects. George Hudson ruined investors and himself with overambitious schemes and dodgy financial dealings. But he also built a vast railway network, particularly across Yorkshire, the Midlands and further north. His name is remembered in street names in towns and cities across the north of England. The Great Western Railway in the 20th century. We left the Great Western Railway in 1900, having converted all of its track to a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches, the standard gauge for the United Kingdom. The company continued to expand in the early 20th century. By 1913, it was involved in the ferry service from Fishguard in Wales to Ireland, had introduced restaurant cars and steam heating in its carriages. It had even expanded into motor buses, covering areas where the railway did not reach. All that changed with the outbreak of the First World War. The main railway companies in Britain were taken under government control, with the shipment of troops and armaments the new priority. Little money was spent on maintenance, and Britain's railways were left in a poor state by the end of the war. The British government required the railway companies to merge into 4 large groups by the Railway Act of 1921. The London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, the Southern Railway and the Great Western Railway. This new GWR included more lines and services than before, but, carefully managed, the company continued to be profitable in spite of the Great Depression, although the motor services were sold off. In 1939, with the start of the Second World War, Britain's railways were again taken under government control. However, this time the change was permanent, and British Railways was formed in 1948. In 1955, what had been the Great Western Railway, and was then called Western Region, operated 3,700 miles of track, nearly 1,300 stations, with 92,000 staff. By 1965, this had reduced to 3,000 miles of track, but only 422 stations and 48,000 staff. British Rail was privatised in the 1990s, and the private company that operates most of the lines still calls itself the Great Western Railway. Much of the infrastructure of the original GWR has been preserved, and several of its locomotives. The development of the railways in Great Britain was an essential part of the Industrial Revolution, and the same spirit of optimism and adventure drove both. Ingenious individuals combined with willing investors to make tremendous advances. There was a thirst for innovation, but there was also great risk and many suffered loss. That sense of optimism drained away with the brutality of the First World War and the depression that followed. Many of the great companies of the 19th century declined in the first half of the 20th century. The Great Western Railway did better than most, and is still remembered fondly. Thank you for watching.